evening's program, and we're anxious to get it started, so I won't spend a lot of time talking to you. In fact, almost none, except for two things. One is to point out this URL, which feel free to come up here and read it. We'd love it if you can put that into your phones or whatever you've got. And also online, it should be in front of you. This URL will enable you to do a little survey, help us to stay in touch as we continue to do the work. The second very important thing I have to say is that we do have restrooms. They are located on the bottom level of the building. So please, if you need to, feel free to get up and do that. Lee.
We are so glad that you all are here. And there are a great many people who are joining us on the live stream and who are also going to use the recording, which will be captured and shared with communities. So we encourage you all to do that. I just want to give you a little bit of a glimpse of all of the people that are joining in this mass movement to respond to great need. And Kay said it would probably be a lot faster if I mentioned all the people that were not participating, but then that wouldn't be as fun. So these are just some of our valued partners that I want to lift up so that you all have them in the space with us, whether they are present physically or just on the live stream or later. B'nai Jeshurun, of course, is our sister synagogue, Rodef Shalom, Upper West Side Open Hearts Initiative, TLC, the Marlene Meyerson JCC, Judson Memorial, the Interfaith Church Center, Justice for Our Neighbors in the House, La Mirada, Ancha Hesed, Venezuelans and Immigrants Aid, Christ Church UMC, Fourth Universalist, John Street UMC, El Nido and the good folks there. New York Annual Conference has been a huge support, as well as Repair the World and First Spanish UMC. There's likely some that I'm forgetting, but you get the point. The point is that we are not at all doing this alone, and we are not doing this branded as St. Paul and St. Andrew. We are a force, a new unsettling force, some might say, that can only be done together. And one of those great partners is Carol Scott, one of our community, who's going to tell you a little bit about the shape of tonight. Come on up, Carol.
Oh, my goodness. Thanks, Lee. Hi. My name's Carol Scott. Karen Collins and I have been working together to put this evening in place. And the first question that we want to ask is why? Why are we having this meeting tonight? Lee mentioned some of the legion of people that are working really hard around the clock, and there are many more that are unnamed, in order to address immediate needs, because we have to, because there's an immediate need crisis happening now. In the chaos of addressing those immediate needs, we also want to take a moment and look a little deeper to learn, how did we get to this place? What caused all these immediate needs? And I just want to ask, I'll throw it out to folks who are here, what are your first thoughts when I say, why are we in this crisis right now? Any ideas? Mm-hmm. United States foreign policy for the last 70 or 80 years. Mm-hmm. Something else? Fear of others. Mm-hmm. Yes. Congress's inability to pass any kind of reasonable immigration legislation. Thank you. Anyone else? Interstate busing. Mm-hmm. Cynical governors on our southern border. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Climate change. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are a lot of ideas that we already have, and I raise that to acknowledge that we're all coming to this work from different places with our own levels of expertise, experience, and knowledge. Nobody's starting from zero. That said, we have folks at different levels. So please take and listen tonight with an open heart. We're going to move through this work together, and we're going to learn maybe unexpected for some folks information, maybe old news to other folks. But I really am excited to have Steve here. So Steve Saccho is an activist lawyer practicing deportation defense and writing in opposition to all migration restrictions and other institutions animated by white supremacy and nationalism. That's so badass, I just wanted to read it off the paper. I first met Steve about 5 years ago working at New Sanctuary Coalition when he was offering his services pro se to folks in deportation proceedings, hours and hours and hours for hundreds of people doing this passionate work. Steve's also the author of Abolishing Citizenship, which was published in the Georgetown Immigration Law Journal winter 2022, and co-author of A Roundtable of Environmental Justice and Border Abolition, published in the Radical History Review 2023. Please do enter comments, questions in the chat on YouTube for folks who are watching online. We have somebody monitoring that, and we're going to bring your questions into the room so we can ask them and have them answered here. Okay, and without further ado, Steve Saccho.
Thanks, Carol and Karen, for inviting me, and St. Paul and St. Andrew for inviting me. I really appreciate any opportunity to talk about this stuff, and I really appreciate your invitation. I'll try to get started because I'm going to attempt to summarize 400 years in 40 minutes. So I'm going to try to move as quickly as I can while still being coherent. My name is Steve Saccho. I'm an immigration attorney at Legal Aid. And I'm not a historian. Let me start with that disclaimer, but I'm going to explain the history of the law as I understand it as a lawyer. So before I get started, there are three, actually, let me first explain the title of this thing. I have written here the history of White Republic regulatory law. Now, I was asked to give you a history of U.S. immigration law, but tonight we are going to think of the phrase immigration law as a phrase forever in quotes, because it does not accurately convey what that law is, where it comes from, or what it intends to do. This description is a much more accurate definition of what that law is, where it comes from, and what it intends to do, and we're going to explain that. Let's talk about the history of U.S. White Republic regulatory law. There are three concepts that I want to explain. First, before we get started on the history itself, three motifs that you're going to see reoccurring throughout the history over and over and over again. The first one is, some of them maybe you're already familiar with, maybe some of them you're not, but I'll go over them quickly. The first is a racial project, which is an effort to reorganize and redistribute resources along racial lines. Many have argued the United States is itself a racial project, and White Republic regulatory law certainly is, and we'll explain why. And the next is the idea that law and race are mutually constitutive. That is, race becomes law, and then law becomes race. Racial ideas become codified into law, and then those laws further shape racial ideas, which are mutable and change over time. And then the third idea that we're going to encounter is this idea of interest convergence. This was an idea given to us by the late great law professor Derek Bell. It's the idea that a brief passing moment in history can occur when the interests of white supremacy and the interests of subordinated people of color converge, resulting in ostensibly anti-racist policy that actually benefits both groups. So it's policy that looks like it's anti-racist, but actually it's helping both the oppressor and the oppressed at the same time. So you're going to see these things pop up again and again, and I'll mention them repeatedly. Okay, so let's move on from there. Okay, so I'm going to, as I said, attempt to cover 400 years in 40 minutes. Don't worry about this timeline because it's going to stay with us the whole time. It's going to be on the slides the whole time. We're going to go through it. I'm going to talk about 15 different years. They're up there. And I'm going to discuss them in 5 separate, distinct periods that we're going to name. And we're going to go through each period one by one. Here are the titles for those eras in history. Inventing the White Republic. Then we're going to move on to Conquest for the White Republic. and then regulating the White Republic, and then converging interests with the White Republic, and then the White Republic fights to endure. I'm sorry that these sound like very depressing Jeopardy categories. I think they just convey like the history and the parts of it that I want to talk about. The term White Republic actually comes to us not from me, but from an author named Alexander Saxton, who wrote a book by that title. And I think it describes what we're going to talk about very, very well. Okay, so moving on. All right, the first era, inventing the White Republic. Okay, so let's start at 1619, and the history of the laws governing migration to North America must begin with the enslavement of human beings and their deportation from Africa to what would become the United States. Many colonies during the early 17th century passed laws governing the trade and forced migration of enslaved people during that century, before the slave trade itself is abolished in 1807. But slavery during the early part of the 17th century is typically based on religion. Africans are considered a slave class because they are not considered Christian, while Christians are subjected to indentured servitude if they don't own land. Race, as we think of it today, is not forged really in full or developed the way we think of it today until after an event in 1676 called Bacon's Rebellion. So key to understanding how slavery is foundational to the creation of what we'll call the White Republic is Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. So Nathaniel Bacon is a Virginia colonist. He leads a revolt of the enslaved and of the indentured, so of people we would today think of as both white and black, both together against the governor of Virginia. That revolt is crushed, but in its wake in 1705, Virginia passes its slave code. Now, this slave code is notable, not because it's the first, it isn't. There were many before, as we discussed. The states had their own codes through the 17th century, but this code uses the word white, and it creates two distinct sets of rights for whites and Africans, one inferior to the other. And while slavery existed in the law before Bacon's Rebellion, references to white and whiteness did not, or so a number of scholars argue. Why? Because Virginia's government learned from Bacon's Rebellion, Bacon's multiracial rebellion, what we would call multiracial today, was that forced labor would be more difficult for the landed gentry to sustain if the laborers were united in their demand for freedom. So inventing a racial caste system, that is inventing whiteness and blackness, as we think of it today, would preserve a lower caste, here the enslaved, whose labor could be exploited, and a higher caste to exploit them, and incidentally, a class of poor whites incentivized in maintaining that hierarchy, even though their economic interests differed from the landed gentry and the rich, thereby dividing labor to prevent further rebellions against capital and landowners. Race is a divide and conquer tactic. This is racial capitalism in its most brutal form, a term given to us by Cedric Robinson. The invention of the myth of race for the purpose of securing capital's access to exploitable labor. That's what's going on here. In other words, racism did not incentivize the invention of slavery. Rather, keeping slavery incentivized the invention of race and racism as we think of it today. And whiteness, and with it the White Republic, were born. I want to just put this quote by an author named Theodore Allen, whose book I'll mention later. So the ruling class took special pains to be sure that the people they ruled were propagandized in the moral and legal ethos of white supremacism. So again, race becomes law, law becomes race. That's what's happening here with the 1705 slave code, right? The law is, Allen uses the term propagandizing the idea of whiteness into people's minds. It didn't come out of nowhere. These ideas were beginning to form at the time, but the law really reified it and nailed it into people's heads that whiteness exists, white people exist, and they're superior to others. And so that's sort of the role that this law is playing. Okay, so by 1790, moving ahead in time, The first naturalization law in the United States secured citizenship exclusively to, quote, free white persons. That's the first naturalization law in the United States. The Supreme Court would later affirm that black people were not entitled to citizenship and had no, quote, had no rights white people were bound to respect in the Dred Scott decision in 1857, just, 60 years later. So again, law became race, race became law. And, Toni Morrison says it in fewer words than anyone ever has. This is the history of how American becomes white, the meaning of American becomes white. Okay, so let's move on to the next one, conquest for the right republic. Okay, so once whiteness has been invented, and an entire nation state founded on the idea that A, whiteness is real, and B, white people are superior to all others, it follows that the nation imagines its destiny to dominate the world, and thus a legacy of colonialism is continually pursued. This is a quote from Du Bois. I'm given to understand that whiteness is ownership of the earth, forever and ever, amen. That's what we're talking about here. So 1830, President Andrew Jackson passes the Indian Removal Act. Of course, white people had been forcing Native Americans off their land for many years before this act, but I note it because this act and the trail of tears that results are really one of the earliest federal deportation laws passed in the United States, and that is how we should think of it. Even the word removal is the euphemism for deportation law today in the current law that enforces migration and makes it exclusive in the United States. Native American scholar Shannon Speed has argued that the modern deportation in modern law is violence that asserts a colonizer's control over its territory. She calls it territorial control by dispossession. And that certainly recalls the Indian Removal Act and others like it. In fact, during this period, the early half of the 19th century, many states have laws that allow them to deport black people to other states, particularly even those who were not enslaved, and regulate their movement through curfews and slave patrols for those that are. These laws refer to people literally as illegals and as aliens, racial slurs which modern immigration law will eventually inherit. Professor Rhonda McGee describes slavery as, quote, our nation's first system of immigration law because it, quote, laid a foundation for both a racially segmented labor-based immigration system and a racially hierarchical nation of immigrants. So the point is the mass banishment of indigenous people westward and the illegalization of black movement between states established the precedent for deportation and exclusion as we think of it today. Later, more of the same. In 1846 is the beginning of the Mexican-American War, and it ends in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which the U.S. annexes half of Mexico, most of the Southwest, including all of Texas, New Mexico, and California. This is a watershed moment in the racialization and exclusion of Mexican people and eventually Latin American people. Out of new territories conquered, there are formed new states. There's a lot of debate over whether new states will permit slavery or not at this time. Some of these new states, like Kansas and Nebraska, for example, introduced the idea of popular sovereignty. Remember that S word, because it's going to come back later. The right of a new state, this is how they defined it, the right of a new state to choose whether it will enslave black people or not, the right to be a so-called slave state. Here we see the word sovereignty used in the law to mean a state's right to keep itself white and white-dominated. The right to make white supremacy law, that was the intention when they used the word sovereignty at this time. Okay, so in the aftermath of the Civil War, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution creates birthright citizenship in the United States. Birthright citizenship, that is, you're born in the US, you are a citizen, birthright citizenship. But there are 2 points that I want to make about this right that are often overlooked. First, at this point, birthright citizenship was only permitted for people racialized as white or black and would not include anyone else racialized otherwise until 1898. Even then, Native Americans could not acquire citizenship by birth until 1940. And second, the second point I want to make is that birthright citizenship should be analyzed through the lens of Bell's interest convergence, because if you want to conquer a continent, you need lots of citizens and laborers to make it happen, which birthright citizenship amply provides, a point that has been made by more than one scholar. It's a way we don't usually think about this area of law. We like to think about it as exceptionally progressive. But when you really look at it in its historical context, you see Bell's point. So the words and ideas that I really want to focus on here: removal, aliens, sovereignty. These are the building blocks of modern immigration law. These are the words that are used over and over again in our statutes and our regulation and in court decisions about immigration. Okay, let's move on to the next era: regulating the White Republic. So in the second half of the 19th century, early 20th, the law continues to try to use citizenship, exclusion, and deportation as a way of regulating the White Republic. That is, as a way of keeping the Republic both white and white dominated. Part of being a White Republic means feeding the maw of racial capitalism with labor, exploitable, vulnerable labor. And to keep that labor vulnerable, it needs to keep laborers in as much of a subordinate position as possible. Fewer workers' rights means more profit. Capital craves caste, just as it did following Bacon's rebellion. So in the 19th century, there is immigration from China to the western United States, where many Chinese immigrants find work building railroads, and among other things. But as their numbers grow, the white majority views them as a threat to the White Republic. So new racial regulation is wanted. Enter the Chinese Exclusion Acts, which ban Chinese immigration into the United States. These acts are joined by white naturalization laws that prohibit anyone who is not white from acquiring citizenship after birth. So you have birthright citizenship for folks born here, but then there's also the process of becoming a citizen if you weren't born here. We usually refer to that as naturalization. A number of people sue the government, trying to argue that they are themselves white in order to acquire citizenship after birth. Among them, people of South Asian and East Asian descent argue that they are white. But the Supreme Court and other federal courts decide, no, we think people of South Asian and East Asian descent are not white and therefore cannot be naturalized. This produces a large body of case law in which the federal courts, by relying on eugenics and other garbage racial science of the era, begin to redefine whiteness and non-whiteness. 52 such cases were heard by federal courts between 1878 and 1952. I believe federal, maybe state and federal, but I think it's just federal, those numbers. It is these cases that shape racial categories such as Asian, and conversely, also shape whiteness. These laws exclude Asians and other people of color and include other Europeans for whom there is never a total ban, like Italians and Jews and people from the periphery of Europe. It is this exclusion and inclusion that racializes the former group as non-white and the latter groups as white. These decisions make people of color synonymous with inferior traits, like stupidity, barbarism, just as they simultaneously make white people synonymous with superior traits, intelligence, civilization, etc. This is a quote from one of the well-known federal cases that interprets the Chinese Exclusion Acts. I won't read it to you. You can read it yourself. It's pretty gross, but it's also explicitly racist. There's no ambiguity there. And that's the Supreme Court talking. I will read it because folks here are saying it's a little too tiny. So this is from the Supreme Court, 1889. Congress considers the presence of foreigners of a different race in this country to be dangerous to peace and security. Its determination is conclusive upon the judiciary. So the Chinese Exclusion Acts were challenged, but upheld by the same Supreme Court that sanctioned apartheid in Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal. In those cases, SCOTUS declared the federal government possesses judicially non-reviewable and exclusive and absolute power over non-citizens' movement to enter and remain within the territory of the United States. The court argued here, in the quote I just read, that this power comes from US sovereignty. Where did we hear that before? And it said, in an echo of the new slave states back before the Civil War, that sovereignty means that if Congress, quote, considers the presence of foreigners of a different race in this country to be dangerous to peace and security, its determination is conclusive upon the judiciary. In other words, the US has the sovereign right to keep the republic white, and the courts may not even review that right. Where does it come from? Does it come from the Constitution? Maybe, kind of. The opinion is not really clear on where it comes from in the Constitution. Maybe it doesn't come from anywhere in the Constitution, but the opinion just says, you know, it's sovereignty. It comes from sovereignty. That's why the US has the right to stay white, the right to exclude who it wants to from both its territory and from citizenship rights, and therefore from human rights. Sure. Well, this is all read to be consistent with the 14th Amendment and with the Civil Rights Act of the 19th century. This is only applying to folks who are excluded from naturalization. That is, people who were not born in the US, but they came to the US and applied for citizenship. And this is the argument the court gave to exclude them. This is still good law, and it's the law that the courts today rely on for the authority to deport, to detain, and to exclude from the United States. Sovereignty. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. So it was asked, essentially, how this can be squared with the Civil Rights Act of the mid-19th century and the Reconstruction era, in which Black Americans had a period of time before 1877 where they could access the political franchise and they could access the legislature and so forth. And the answer is that this applies not to folks born here, but to folks born outside the US who want to become citizens. So it's a narrower part of the population. Among other things, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, it gets interpreted, right? It gets sort of like slightly less narrow between the 1860s and 1940. In time, the court's campaign of intense racialization calcifies into a congressional ban on immigration in the US based upon race in a 1924 act. Oh, I do want to point this out. So this is we're talking about, in the court's active racialization of an invention of, Asianness and Asian race, and it's sort of a crafting of whiteness at the same time and of white race. And this is a quote from a federal opinion in 1921 interpreting this law that excludes people of certain races from naturalization. And it says, the yellow or brown racial color is the hallmark of Oriental despotisms. This is a federal court case opinion published in 1921. So here it's associating a particular racialized group with barbarity, with despotism, and by inversely associating white people with democracy and civilization. So again, race becomes law, law becomes race. We can see the courts shaping racial mythology here during this period. Okay, so the 1924 Act, called the Johnson-Reed Act, creates a quota system for Europeans. That is, it limits the number of Europeans that can come from each country. It gives the northern, more western, whiter European countries larger number of visas, and the Europeans from the southern states and the Slavic states fewer visas. The idea there was to exclude Italians and Jews more than they, excluded northwestern Europeans who were considered whiter. It bans immigration from most of Asia and places very low ceilings on immigration from other parts of the world, like Africa. With the highest numbers given to Europeans with the stated intention of keeping whites in the majority. That was the purpose. This act slams the gate closed on the white republic. President Calvin Coolidge, who signed the act into law, was clear as a bell as to its intentions. Here is a quote from him. "America must be kept American." That sounds familiar. "Biological laws show that Nordics deteriorate when mixed with other races." So you can hear eugenics speaking right through the president. And it spoke through most of the lawmakers who wrote this 1924 act and signed it into law. This is just the race thinking of the time. Laws during the era are animated by the eugenics movement, which racialized poverty, racialized disease, and racialized even political ideology. This is the era when the public charge restrictions are passed into law. The public charge restrictions are the idea that if there's a chance that you might become dependent on welfare, well, that's grounds to, you'll become a public charge, and that's grounds to deport you or not allow you to attain particular status or citizenship in the United States. This is when the restrictions on, quote, diseases of public health significance come into law. Again, disease was racialized as an inferior, a trait that signified racial inferiority. And even the deportation of suspected anarchists and communists, like Emma Goldman, who was deported around this era. Again, those ideologies were also kind of racialized. It's only the lower races that have these ideas. All of these restrictions on immigration of permanent resident status remain in the law today. This is all still law, but were passed with the intent of purifying and keeping pure American racial stock. All of this is intended to keep the white republic as white as possible. These are still good laws today, but today we've normalized them. These rules remain the codification of eugenical thinking, but somehow there's this legislative amnesia that we have, where we look at the law today and we think, oh, there are other reasons that we have it in the law today. But no, we need to, it's an ahistorical view to look at these laws today and think that they're about policy or politics, and they're clearly not. This period of history really makes it clearer that citizenship itself is used as a caste system. Law constructs non-citizens as people whose movement can be policed and who can be kept vulnerable to capital. Okay, moving on. Converging interests with the white republic. This is the next stage of time. This is the Cold War era. So the Cold War era in the history of white republic regulatory law should be thought of as an interest convergence era. It was the Cold War, and it was in the federal government's geopolitical interests. So I mentioned Derek Bell before. Derek Bell was a law professor who came up with this idea. In his article, when he explains the idea of interest convergence, he talks about the federal government's geopolitical interest to appear more democratic, to win hearts and minds during the Cold War. So the idea was, the United States and the Western democracies are better than communism. How do you know? Well, we treat our minorities better, quote unquote. We're better than they are morally. We're not racist. We're better in every way that you can imagine. And that constant effort to win hearts and minds, to change the laws in the United States, to do that, to win the Cold War, motivated a lot of changes in the law. And Bell argued that is what motivated Brown v. Board. That's what motivated the Civil Rights Act. That the legal changes that you start to see during the Civil Rights era, he attributes in part, not to take away any strength from the many great people who made those, who pushed and changed the social fabric of the United States to make those laws possible. But he argues that part of the reason they were made possible is because of this interest convergence. Another scholar, Richard Delgado, has argued the same interests converged to motivate the 1965 Act, the 1965 Immigration Act, called the Hart-Keller Act. And over the course of the next 20 years, it motivates a lot more than that. So the 1965 Hart-Keller Act abolishes the quotas based on nationality and race that we talked about in 1924. Although racial restrictions were actually abolished in 1952, those quotas that I talked about before remained, and the 1965 Act gets rid of those. Instead, This act ties visas to family members of citizens and permanent residents and employees. For extended relatives, it makes an equal number of visas available for each country, about 20,000. This had the intended effect of continuing to exclude non-white people by creating years-long waiting lists for global South countries that send many people, like Mexico and India, for example, and much shorter or non-existent lines for wealthier, whiter countries that send far fewer people to the United States, like Ireland and France, for example. This was intended to appear anti-racist only, but it was intended to actually preserve white supremacy. Let's look at a quote from Ted Kennedy, who was this act's champion in Congress at the time. He also was not ambiguous. The ethnic mix of this country will not be upset. Here, Kennedy is reassuring his colleagues, don't worry, the white republic will stay white and white-dominated and white majority. It's okay. Yeah, we're going to let some more people in, but we'll stay in control. The ethnic mix will not be upset. We often think about, the 1965 Act is often cited in an adjacent way to the Civil Rights Act of that time as, you know, a progressive landmark in like our law, like look at how far we've come. But really, again, you really need to look at it through Bell's interest convergence because, you know, Kennedy's quote here really shows the intention behind it and really shows why it was in everyone's interest to do what they did in this law. So this anti-racist facade is so thinly veiled that the bill's champion, Ted Kennedy explicitly says on the floor of the Senate in so many words, yeah, don't worry, our republic will stay white. So indeed, the entire modern family-based visa scheme, whereby visas are available only to those with family members already in possession of permanent residence and US citizen status, only furthers the racial dynamics of the status quo that Kennedy is referring to here, just as the 1924 laws did. And then we have the Refugee Act of 1980, still the Cold War, still the same interests are converging. This act was likewise motivated by the Cold War. It served US geopolitical interests to have the US be seen as welcoming refugees from behind the Iron Curtain. Most of the asylum seekers at this time are escaping one communist regime or another, in Vietnam, in Cuba, Eastern Europe, etc. This act invented the modern asylum application process that we know today. There was a means of seeking refugee status prior to this act, but only if you were already in deportation proceedings. And it had a much higher evidentiary standard. But so this really invents the kind of affirmative request for asylum system that we think of today. And really, it was thought of as a way of combating communism. You could also add the IRCA, the amnesty of 1986 that was passed under Reagan to this list of sort of Cold War interest convergence legislature. We want to ask ourselves, like, why would Reagan approve amnesty for 4 million people if he didn't think there was something to be gained in the context of the Cold War? Clearly, there was something to be gained at that time. I mean, it was a different time, and the Republican Party looked a little different, but still, it's clear that there was some interest in doing that, and that Bell's theory is really applicable to think about here. Okay, last of the 5 eras. Our current era, the white republic fights to endure. Eventually, the Cold War ends, of course, 1989, and with it, this big interest convergence ends too. And after 1989, you see federal policy toward non-US citizens suddenly become much more hostile. The federal government isn't trying to prove its human rights bona fides anymore, because capitalism won. Instead, the federal government is being influenced by the white backlash against civil rights that has been stoked by Nixon and Reagan and now Gingrich in this era of the 1990s, and to which the Clintons pander to in this era. Public assistance has been racialized at this time as a handout to undeserving Black Americans, and since 1965, there has been a large amount of immigration of people of color into the United States as a result of the 1965 Act. And so again, as it did in 1924, the keepers of the hegemony of the white republic feel their power threatened. The result is 2 big pieces of legislation, the PROWRA legislation, or PROWRA, that, quote, guts welfare as we know it. That was the big legislation that really like decimated public assistance at the federal level in the United States, and to some degree at the state level. And then another one called IRA. I'm behind on my slides here a bit. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigration Responsibility Act. Immigration lawyers sometimes call it IRA or IRA. It has lots of funny names. And it's difficult to overstate just how much this act further criminalized movement in the United States. It expands grounds for deportation and internment in many ways. And I'll use the word internment as a more accurate word to describe what we euphemistically call in the law detention, because it would be more accurate to think of it as internment. And I could go into the history of why that might be, but I didn't have time. I would love to tie that to Japanese-American internment during World War II, which was actually assisted by the Border Patrol at the time. We could talk about that and draw those connections if we in the Q&A if we like. So this creates new grounds of exclusion, particularly for people with arrest or criminal conviction histories. It doubles down on public charge. It expands the definition of something called aggravated felonies, which is a way to kick someone out of the country because of criminal conviction. It raises the bar for certain forms of relief. It introduces deportation without trial for some folks who cross at the border. It expands the authority to detain. It introduces bars to reentry if you have any unlawful presence in the U.S. It introduces these crazy agreements with local law enforcement that allow them to enforce the immigration laws on the federal government's behalf. So after 1996, it's kind of all downhill from there. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Bush transforms INS into DHS, effectively militarizing immigration enforcement. Obama, despite DACA, earns the name deporter-in-chief because he deports a larger number of non-citizens than anyone before him. Again, I want to encourage us to look at DACA, Obama's signature, immigration effort, through Bell's interest convergence lens. What was the white republic's interest in DACA and in the, quote, good immigrant, bad immigrant narrative that DACA furthers? And then, of course, there's the Trump regime, which requires no explanation or introduction or recollection on our part. But it's the policies of the Trump regime are so consistent with the history that we just discussed that when you look at quote-unquote immigration law as white republic regulatory law, it's not only unsurprising that someone like Trump was elected at this point in history, or at all, but in fact it would have been inexplicable if someone like him had not been elected president at some point, or during this era. How am I doing on time? Okay. I want to just quickly come back to these three principles, these three themes that run through this history. Racial projects, and the idea that race and law are mutually constitutive, and Bell's interest convergence. And I want to look at just compare some random years in this history to kind of, there's so much symmetry, when you, at different points in history on this issue, that it really helps us to compare what maybe ostensibly might look like unrelated periods or events. If we compare the Virginia Slave Code to the Chinese Exclusion Act, we can think of them both as reactionary. Obviously, they're unbelievably different in many, many ways. But let's look at the few ways they're similar. They're both reactionary. The Virginia Slave Code is a reaction to Bacon's Rebellion. The Chinese Exclusion Acts react to birthright citizenship and the Reconstruction advances, before the Compromise of 1877, of course. They're both racial projects. They both seek to propagandize race in people's minds and whiteness in people's minds. And each shaped whiteness and its opposites. Let's compare the 1924 National Quotas Act and the 1996 IRA deportation and internment expansions. So they were both racial projects meant to keep the U.S. white and white-dominated. And the 1924 Act was a reaction to a previous large wave of immigration, and it was inspired by the eugenics movement at the time. And the 1996 Act was a reaction in many ways to the previous large wave of migration from people of color into the United States, and to some degree to the civil rights era. And it was inspired by the Reagan-era white backlash that was really rearing its head at the time. Let's compare the 1965 Act with the DACA policy. In 1965, it was politically expedient to open immigration into the United States and eliminate racial quotas. But while affirming defense of the white republic through family visa case caps, for example. In 2010, it was politically expedient to open immigration into the US to the young and educated. At least it was for Obama and the Democratic Party, I think. Could certainly be argued. But while affirming defense of the white republic through increased deportation and border enforcement, which Obama also did. So just a reflection again on sort of the 5 periods that we covered. I want to sort of think about redefining this term, immigration law, maybe stop thinking about it that way and think about it instead, as I said, as white republic regulatory law, which also, reminds us that it's consistent with other white projects and the history of racist laws in the United States against many groups of people. If we could use kind of a working definition, if we could sort of try to express a working definition of white republic regulatory law, it's the regulation of movement and the enforcement of caste for the purpose of maintaining white hegemony and majority and maintaining capital's access to a pool of vulnerable labor. And when you think about what we call the immigration laws through that definition, their purpose becomes clearer, their history becomes clearer, and their need to be abolished becomes clearer. For me, looking at this history and thinking about it, I've come, as I have as a practicing immigration lawyer for 8 years, I come to three conclusions about what the hell all this means. Citizenship is itself, for me, a codification of whiteness. You can see that from the beginning. I mean, the first naturalization act in the United States in 1790 literally says, you're a citizen if you're white, period. Therefore, citizenship is a caste system. And caste systems are used to regulate the white republic, keeping it white majority and white dominated. And therefore, democracy, which requires the end of caste, by definition, requires the abolition of citizenship. So I've just written an article where I make that argument that citizenship as an idea should be abolished in the United States, and explaining what then could replace it in the law. There are copies available for anyone who's present. And for anyone who wants it, I'm happy to send you the digital copy by email. You could reach out to me. I'm happy to send that to you. So I just want to end with 8 books that I want to recommend everyone read. The next time you have time to read 8 books, these are, if you read all these books together, you'd get a really good picture of the history that we just discussed. A really good sense of the parts of it that are synchronous, that repeat over and over again in our politics and our society, the violence that just keeps rhyming over and over again and that keeps happening over and over again in this system. And hopefully, I think, none of us can afford to stop reading. Let me just say that. I am constantly enlightened by so many amazing thinkers and doers who are writing on this issue. I can't afford to stop reading. No one can afford to stop reading. There's just so much insight out there into how these things, how these laws work, and how this violence operates. And I really encourage folks to start with these 8 authors. And my contact information is at the bottom, and I'll open it to questions at this point.
Great.
So Steve, thank you so very, very much. This is awesome. I think we've all, speaking for myself, but I think probably for other people, we've all learned a lot and have a lot to think about. So we're going to take a few minutes right now to have an opportunity to ask Steve questions. Following that, we want to save a little bit of time to talk briefly about immediate things that we can do, and then also things that we want to learn more about. And both of those two conversations will help us to think about the next time we get together, which will be January 31st. But first, I'm going to walk around with a mic. Is there anybody who has questions? And someone is also monitoring the live stream so that if there are questions there, we'll incorporate those into our conversation. If that sounds good to you.
Sounds good.
Okay. So are there any Great.
Oh,
So
there's two
I'm going
over
to start
there,
over
too.
here, and then I'll go over to the other side.
Thank you. I'm interested. If citizenship ends, what replaces it?
Yes, great question. I can answer it in 60 pages. The short of it is that you already have a model for what political membership looks like that does not involve exclusion. And that's the federal law that governs the movement of U.S. citizens between states. So the short of it is, federal law has said pretty clearly that every U.S. citizen has the right to move between the states without hindrance, visit any state and have equal participation in that state's institutions as residents, as a visitor, so they can work, they can use the courts, et cetera, and an equal right to reside in any state by choice. So it would sort of look like that, moving between, pick your country, China, Senegal, Germany to the United States, would be just like moving between New York and New Jersey. There's no visa, there's no passport, you move there, and when you move there, because you move there, because you live there, you become a citizen of that state, period. Voting citizen. Why? Because you live there. That's it. In California, if you move today from New York City to California, on the day you move to California, as is my understanding of the law, you can essentially sign an affidavit that says, I live in California now, I'm a California resident. And you can vote the next day. Or you can register to vote the next day. So that's how it would work. We have a model for how that works. We don't think about who's coming into New York from Pennsylvania. Do we know them? Do we know their intentions? We don't think about, are the Floridians going to take jobs from New Yorkers? We don't think about, are West Virginians going to bring crime into New York City? We don't ask those questions, or at least the law doesn't ask those questions at any point. The law prohibits those questions. It prohibits the states from acting on those questions because we start with a presumption that movement is a fundamental right for Americans. And I'm merely arguing that movement is a fundamental right for everyone. There were two more questions over here.
Okay. I believe you had a question, yeah?
I actually had the same question that you did. I was curious about what next, but maybe just to follow up on that question, the economics of this that you've explored so wonderfully are also, when you think of citizenship and when you think of it globally, the argument often is that you need borders in order to grow your economy. So, for example, if you look, I mean, we all know the kind of capitalist argument behind that, but I think there's also arguments from Asia where those countries said, we want to control our borders and grow our economics in order to fight against the kind of the larger system. So they might argue, we need the borders, we need citizenship, and that's not necessarily, I'm just curious as to how that jives with what you're thinking.
Yeah, that's a good question. There are a lot of economists who have written about that exact idea that you're asking about. What role does movement, freedom of movement, play in economics and in the capitalist system? And there are a lot of economists, Brian Kaplan in particular comes to mind, who has a great book that's actually a graphic novel that explains exactly why what he terms trillion-dollar bills on the sidewalk is the phrase that he uses to argue that if you actually removed all the restrictions on movement, you would, double world GDP or something crazy like that. That actually movement restricts economic growth and capitalist growth, and that if you removed that movement, it would actually be a boon to people. Now, I'm not going to make those arguments because I'm not interested in, I don't think capitalism is the reason that we should have free movement, but there are lots of people out there who do. You could call many libertarians your broken clock allies. They're broken, but they're right twice a day. And the thing that they're actually right about, often, sometimes, some of them, is the freedom of movement. They want free movement, they want to take down the borders. And I mention them only because a lot of libertarian economists have written to that issue, have written about this topic, this idea that if you just took away these restrictions on movement, it would actually explode economic growth in a lot of parts of the world. So I'm not an economist, but they are, so I guess I would defer to their arguments in response to that, those kind of important questions, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to take one more question from people participating in the church, and then we'll go to the live stream.
Your presentation was very interesting. I learned a lot, and I think that it's an interesting way to think about all these issues. We have a real crisis at our borders right now, and in our city. We're dealing with it here in this church and in other places. And Congress has refused to address any of these issues for decades, and not very many people who are making those kinds of decisions are going to agree with the ideas that you've proposed. And just wondering, what practical things do you recommend that can happen now to be dealing with these crises that we're facing on our border, and the people that aren't able to come, or the people who do come that aren't getting support and services?
Yeah, great question. It was several questions, but they were all really helpful and important to raise. So I'll try to address them. So there are a lot of activists who are fond of saying that there's no crisis at the border is the crisis. And that Congress, while it looks like Congress has sort of failed and that the system is broken, actually Congress has been doing exactly what it intends to do. And the laws are working exactly as they are intended, which is to harm and exclude and deport and destroy people in the ways that they are hurt and harmed and destroyed. And that is happening actually quite successfully, because that's the goal. The white republic is still fighting to stay white dominated, and it's succeeding in it in a number of economic and political ways. But there's a movement of people who identify as prison and police abolitionists who are developing this idea of non-reformist reforms, this idea of laws which are changes to the law, which are consistent with the world that we want, in this case, the world beyond citizenship, a world beyond borders, and how to redirect our energy to sort of advocate for those laws, as opposed to reformist ones that just sort of, add to the systems we already want to get rid of anyway. So that idea of the non-reformist reform sort of guides us. It's an organizing strategy, as some authors and activists like Miriam Kaba have put it, that guides us and tells us what laws we should support and what laws we shouldn't. And there's a lot of laws at the local level, municipal and state level, that we should support that are consistent with a world beyond citizenship, that we actually have a chance of changing. So things like non-citizen voting in the New York City Council, things like New York State driver's licenses for the undocumented, which we have accomplished in recent years. Opening up Medicaid so that every New Yorker can have access to it. Currently, they can't. Without status, many people are excluded from that. There are lots of benefits and rights at the municipal and local level that are changeable and that are tangible and that we could begin to change. Those laws are consistent from an abolitionist perspective with the world that we want, and we can pour resources into those laws. And there are a lot of organizations moving to close detention centers, close internment camps around the country. Some of them have succeeded. The Berks County, child and family prison for non-citizens in Pennsylvania was recently shut down, in part because of a lot of activists who were constantly banging the drum, shut the goddamn thing down. For so many years, eventually they did. Closing specific prisons, specific points of incarceration is also consistent with a world in which citizenship is abolished. We have to put our resources there also. So I guess the short answer to that is actually there are lots of things we could be doing. There are lots of movements and organizations working to shut down this institution or change this law such that it's consistent with the world that we want. And that's where we should be putting our energy and where we can put our volunteer hours.
Okay, very thought-provoking. From the live stream.
Yeah, there's two questions here that Steve. One is just someone was intrigued by interest convergence and would love some more examples of that to kind of sort of spell that piece out. And then do you want me to ask the other question as well, right?
Well, let's take that one first.
Okay,
Can we
and
take
then
that one first?
there's another one from an immigration lawyer that's a little more technical.
Yeah. Yeah. So the big one that Bell talks about in his first article on this is Brown v. Board, and I did send around that article to everyone. That's really the prime example. I mean, his argument is look, you know, the time had come. You know, it was the time. It was the setting. It was the geopolitical atmosphere that kind of helped facilitate these changes. I am sure that if you studied different areas of laws that we think of as progressive, one way or another, and were I more well-versed in laws and other areas of statutes and regulations and other areas of law, I'm sure we could come up with lots of examples. You know, but the 1965 Act and Bell's original article are just the ones that I happen to know about. But if you start to look at laws through Bell's lens, you really start to see more of the background and the political context in which these laws are passed. Too often, I mean, I think it happens with all of us, but it also happens very much with lawyers, where we get very focused on what the law is and is not, and where there's ambiguity within it, and we become ahistorical, and we forget about how these things came to be, because we're so focused on the present. And so, I mean, Bell is really asking us to remember the history, and I think that's the lesson of each of these laws. And then the next one?
Yeah, and the next one comes from another immigration lawyer, which is working with clients that are entering this racist system, and many of whom have fled from racist oppression elsewhere. What insights would you offer of, sort of advising them, just on a very, sort of personal level in relation to all that you've shared?
Oh God, I sometimes I like to think of my role as an immigration lawyer, again in quotes, as Virgil in Dante's Inferno. You know, I'm just escorting you through hell. I kind of know the landscape a little bit, and I can show you what all the different levels mean. And my power is extremely limited, and my role is limited, and I also can't accomplish anything. And the client is the center of the story. The client is Dante. It is Dante's Inferno. It is Dante's story. So center the client as much as you can. Decenter yourself. And there's a lot of work going on around building collaborative, community-based representation that is building a team of community members around people who have been targeted by the White Republic regulatory system, but with deportation and detention. Having a social worker and a lawyer and journalist and family members and neighbors and the person themselves who is the target of the violence come together as a team and develop a strategy around these laws. Do you need someone who knows the law to help such a person? Yeah, you do. But you also need the realization that law is often applied inconsistently, and that it is more a servant to interests of power than it is to stare decisis or precedent or proper interpretation, that all law is political, and that it is often, applied politically or always applied politically. See Bell's interest convergence, that sometimes it's applied in a nice way because there's some interest in applying it that way, and sometimes not so much. But the more community involvement you have and the more eyes that you have on the system, the easier it is to push against sometimes the nasty, violent political edge of that system. And with a lot of community involvement, you can get better outcomes for clients sometimes that the lawyer couldn't do alone. And so I think those are perspectives that are really important to bring to bear.
Thank you very much. Okay, so why don't we move to the next part of the program? So I'm going to pass the mic to Lee, and you're going to talk us through immediate things that we can do.
Thank you, Steve. I don't know about y'all, but yeah, let's do that. I have a notebook full of notes, and that is the best way of leaving a lecture, so thank you. Some of the things that I'm going to mention tonight, you folks know. Some of them you might not. So let's just say, in general, reach out by email. First and foremost, all of the things that we are plugged into doing with responding to direct needs are done with lots of partners. Right at the top, I mentioned 17 partnering organizations, some of which are in this very room right now, that are helping this work along. But we sincerely are trying to go about joining this movement differently in the way that instead of one shop trying to do every single thing, we're trying to look at the landscape, look at our partners, and fill in gaps, then refer out and resource, widening the support, widening the community around our friends. So with that in mind, these are some of the things that we are working with in-house with our partners. So a great many of these things are staffed with volunteers through Lots of Helping Hands, which is just an online database that we use so that we can kind of keep it all together as best we can. So joining Lots of Helping Hands as a community, you'll be able to see the calendar. All of these tasks are listed, and you can find something that suits your life and what your gifts are and your schedule. But we have 5 young men who live in sanctuary shelter here in the church. And so daily meals are needed every night. That's dinner, twice a week, lunch and breakfast are provided. And even if you look at the calendar today, which I did just a couple of hours ago, we have 6 open meals in the next 10 days. So there's a great need. I should just mention also, we have 353 volunteers registered on LOTSA, so it's a huge number, but in actuality, the people who are really responding day to day are about a core of 50. So if you're in that 353, yes, but it's step 1, like sign up for something, please. Okay, so meals, we need you. That's something that you can do for the guys here. Another way to support arriving migrants who are settling into shelters, not here, right, because we can't bring everybody in, especially those shelters in the Bronx. We're partnering with La Mirada in a new way, in addition to the food that's going into shelters from them. We're taking welcome backpacks, which you have heard about probably, that are stuffed full with essential goods. So about 100 backpacks a month are going to folks arriving in the shelters, and those have to be packed. And that work is happening literally up there in the balcony area of the church, while downstairs we're distributing goods under the leadership of Julia Teller, who's on the back row. And that happens in 2 shifts on Mondays, at 11 and then again at 1. You can sign up on Lots of Helping Hands. Then, if you have a little Spanish speaking familiarity, friendly to fluent, I'll say, then you are most welcome and needed to be on the distribution crew. So Mondays, that's our resourcing day. From 9 to 11, we're doing direct response. Yes, Sydney? Oh, Well, yes, and also you can kind of come up here afterwards, Sydney. So you're writing so beautifully, Karen, and so small. But it's good. You're just going to challenge it. We're challenged tonight. We're challenged. But it is very, very nice, legible. So 9 to 11, that's when essentially the sanctuary turns into a resource fair, right? And so folks arrive, and I'll just clue you into an overwhelming yesterday where I arrived just after 7 a.m. We already had 30 people who had been here since 6 a.m. And by 10:45, we had seen over 225 folks come through. We were completely amazed at the outpouring of need. So when they come, they have the possibility of connecting with Justice for Our Neighbors for legal support. They have Venezuelans and Immigrants Aid to connect to that mutual aid network in the community. We have a clothing and goods corner. We have an essential needs stuff with stuff like Metrocards and diapers, menstrual pads, dictionaries, hats, gloves, etc. And we also have Greenwich House Workforce, who is signing people up for ESL classes and things like that. So we need people to help the flow and function of all of that happen. And again, Spanish speaking is really highly needed. So you can sign up for that on LATSA. And again, you can talk to Carol and I if you have any more questions about that. That's on Mondays. Also, we are partnering with folks who are trying to support the families of PS 87, about 30 to 40 migrant families settled in that community. And so we're working to provide kitchen space for them to be able to cook their own meals that are healthy and wanted, and then store their stuff, which they can't do living in shelters. And new opportunities are on the horizon, so stay tuned if you're interested, because we're trying to make some direct connections between homework help that is happening here on Wednesday evenings and those kids and families on Wednesday evenings. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, play, education, tutoring, etc., then speak to Charlene or Kay or me. And all of this requires funding, right? So you can always give and encourage others to give in your networks, outside your networks, directly through the website with a designation of migrant support. There's so much else that's going on. Anything else in the room? I know my partner's on the back pew right over there from First Spanish. What's up, People's Church? There's loads of stuff happening, and we want to also partner and direct folks to those resources, again, working together. So if anybody has something to shout out right now as an opportunity to plug into, that'd be great. Otherwise, let me know afterwards, and we'll put it out to our larger network. Anything? Yeah. Okay, exactly how many families?
38.
38. Yeah, it's okay, yes. There are 38 families that have now become part of the PS 87 community. Thanks, Steph, for the question.
And that's true of other...
And that's exactly. This is happening. Stephanie's a teacher, so she also has had an influx of students coming. And the schools are really doing a tremendous effort in responding, and parent coordinators have never been so needed. God bless parent coordinators. Any other? Yes, thank you. Go for it. We have a, Karen, or Kay, you want to go back to the back? Sure. Aurelis.
Arelis Figueroa here. Great to be here. And we have been in conversation about, working together, St. Paul St. Andrew, First Hispanic, Grace United Methodist, and the Riverside Church.
Yes.
So we really need to have that conversation. But also something that we are doing at First Hispanic is starting a worship service, or a space for them to worship, to be together, to create that community. And that has been very powerful, and to listen to them.
What time is that service? Is it at 1 o'clock?
That's going to be on, when? We're going to do, yeah. Because we're trying to find out what's most convenient for folks. Yes.
Yeah.
In the beginning, during the week on Wednesdays, it was working out Wednesdays at 4. We'll have an updated schedule for that.
Okay.
And it'll be a day during the week,
And as well as, I'm sorry. Hi, everybody. I'm Reverend LeBron. I'm over at the People's Church on the East Side. I was sharing that we had started a service, or it's more like a testimony time, really. It becomes time for them to share their stories of their journey and make connections to the God that walks with us on the journey, right? And we were doing them Wednesdays at 4 and then also meeting on Sundays. We keep going around with their schedule. They were doing OSHA classes, and so that kind of worked with that schedule. That has kind of shifted. So but we keep updating Lee on what the schedule is so that you all can share that information with folks who come here on Monday. And thank you for all the work that you're doing to bring us together, and hopefully we'll join you all on Mondays to see the action happening here on a Monday.
Yes, wear comfortable shoes. That's what we learned.
I just want to say that we have so many stories. Like, they were telling us how they, as they were crossing and walking, like for months, they would always go and gather next to the river. So they came, and they all have food in their backpack. So they just put it together. This guy have rice, and there was someone with a pot. They have a fire. They went to the river and catch some fishes, and they do like some rice with fish. And he said, like, I don't know how, like more than 40 people ate. And I said, you know what? That is exactly what happened. You know, maybe you remember in the Bible something that Jesus fed like 5,000 people. That's happened. That was the miracle, and you were doing miracles there.
A familiar story. Yes, that's exactly what we're doing. Multiplying the effort, right? Multiplying the effort. So with good partners.
And a lot of what happens in the space and in other spaces, you know, is that mutual aid and community forming and stuff, creating space for that to happen. Paul?
Yeah, it is such an evolving situation, as Dolimar, Reverend LeBron put it. One of the things that JFON needs, it evolved even from 2 weeks ago when we first visited. We need help with preparing motions to transfer venue for so many of the folks. One fellow had his court date in Atlanta, others had in other parts hither and yon. And so we need fluent in Spanish volunteers who can help us with putting together these motions to transfer venue. They're very simple, and we would have it overseen by an attorney, and they would sign off on it with a limited rep with respect to that. But we need help with that.
Absolutely, and we do have a database that is specifically for folks who are have identified and come forward as Spanish-speaking who are interested in that type of work, so we'll combine the database with the need. Great. Okay, Carol, come on forward. Thank you, Kay, for being the mic watcher.
I just want to share in the chat that there's a shout out from Kiana at B'nai Jeshurun, that they're so glad to be here online. So we can't see all the folks online, but there's a big shout out from BJ and others.
And they brought 6 carts of toiletry supplies that is waiting for us to bundle, so thank you.
Great. So I just want to segue a little bit from all of the opportunities to join in and support the immediate response stuff that's happening now that's so important to, this is the first of 2 meetings that we have planned. January 31st, we're having a follow-up meeting. So I want to just pull from our conversation tonight, what are we interested in learning more about? What are some things that we think we might be able to organize around finding places where we can apply pressure or maybe move that needle just a little bit towards justice in some of these larger situations that are happening? Some things that came up during the conversation, I'll just call out things that were mentioned. Prison and police abolition work. Non-reformist reform. That whole concept, it just seems so beautiful to me personally, the idea of creating the kingdom that we want, right? Working towards the reality that we want right now, creating the as-if right now. I don't know if other people are on that plan too, but that's one thing. Building what we want. There were also some mentions about specific local laws and policies that would be towards that end, like non-citizen voting, driver's license for non-citizens, open Medicaid and benefits for non-citizens, closing detention centers. Those were just a couple of things that came out. What else are folks feeling passionate or moved or burning about for our follow-up meeting? Working papers, employment authorization cards for non-citizens. Okay.
I would love a parallel history of the struggles of peoples that go along with what Steve so eloquently shared. But there are so many examples of industrial workers of the world, Wobblies, 100 years ago, but folks that were resisting each of those sets of laws at every point. And I know Steve only had 40 minutes, so maybe if we had 8 minutes, we could have that history. But we need to know those struggles in the past to learn lessons of what worked and what didn't.
I'll just summarize what the ask is for, and that's the parallel history to all of this oppressive growth of white supremacy, the parallel history of resistance. Name the organizations again that you mentioned, the workers' unions, the Wobblies. There's a rich history of resistance that we also need to keep the pulse live now. We are also not coming out of a vacuum, right? We're not inventing resistance here. Other things? Yes, Dorlamar.
There's a huge history in the United States of, the abolitionist movement was a multiracial movement that was struggling against this. The women's suffrage movement had its racist components, but there were multiracial components. So it's just reclaiming the lessons of resistance from each generation that refused to acknowledge the Chinese Exclusion Act. I mean, I'll give one quick example.
Sure,
In 1996, I was meeting with social workers and hospital workers about the IRA laws of how hospitals could delay the reporting by 30 days to say, we'll treat anybody, but we won't be reporting on this, according to these laws, for at least another month. So people have time to kind of, so there were ways of resisting those laws even as they were being put in place.
Great. Dorlamar.
Yeah, there's so much that came up in this conversation about citizenship and so much that we can do. Definitely figuring out how to study that topic more, I think, is really important to know our history. I think also this idea of resistance, right? So one of the things that I have not heard much about around this specific situation has been a lot of direct action or kind of direct action opportunities to be able to protest or to show up. I don't know, I think so many of us have been so busy with just meeting the need in the immediate that has not, I haven't seen much of that happening. But, this whole idea of studying what groups have done in the past, understanding the way law has worked historically, this concept of citizenship that is a construction, right? So any opportunities around direct action and how, as faith communities, we can mobilize direct action, whatever that looks like right now. I know it's hard when it's the same people that are also meeting the immediate response. So, but I think that's always something that we should keep together and, leaning on other organizations, maybe like Poor People's Campaign, that kind of do more of that focus, but also giving that as an opportunity, because I've had people come up to me and ask me, well, where can I go? Where's the protest? Where are we showing up to, wanting to show up somewhere? And again, I don't know that that's for us to organize, but how do we find where that's happening or how that's happening, and how we also include that as part of our response to this?
Yeah, I think that's really important, and especially when you said, I don't know if that's ours to organize. That doesn't mean that we don't go and stand behind the people that are already doing this work. There are so many people out there on the streets, in the streets right now, doing that work. And our responsibility, I feel like, I'm sorry, I'm speaking, taking a little privilege of the mic, I guess. Our responsibility would be to find out how we can help them, what do they need from us, and then go provide it. So yeah, finding out more about direct action stuff that's happening right now on the ground. The other thing that you mentioned was, could you just at some point remind people about the survey? Yep. Yeah, sure. So Karen is asking me to remind folks about the survey. So if you're in the room here, just take a minute, pull out your phone and enter this tiny URL. This is a survey that will just gather your contact information for the purposes of follow-up to this meeting. We're not going to put you on any mailing lists other than, the occasional email from Karen or myself about, here's a summary of what we talked about, here's what we're hoping to do going forward. Y'all are here, so you're interested, so please do that. I'm sorry? The URL is not working for you? Okay. It's also in the chat for folks that are online. It's in the chat on YouTube. I can connect you with it after we're done and make sure that we get you on the survey. There was one thing I wanted to mention before we wrap up, and I apologize for running a little bit over time, but I think it's really important. You talked about, Steve mentioned, talking about community involvement and a holistic approach to supporting folks who are in this racist, oppressive system of deportation. That might be something that we can think about. How do we do that? How do we create a community around folks? Because it's not only the lawyer that they need, it's also the social worker, it's also the person to just interpret the maze of what they're going through. It's also the listening ear and the spiritual support. So that might be something that we think about too. Anything else before I hand it over? Yeah.
Yeah, two quick things. One, Kelly raised the intersection and also lessons from the prison abolition and police abolition movements. And so there's some similarities and crossovers there.
Yeah.
And then the second was Ben's raised about what are some non-reformist reform efforts in New York City around immigrants and immigration rights. So the non-reformist reforms.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Right. So we have some research to do before our next meeting. But I think it will be helpful. And ideally, with this rich background that we have and the wealth of resources that we have in our time, in our efforts, in our hearts, and in our money to support folks who are doing the action now, I'm really excited about what we can do next. There is no one solution to this horrific problem. When I talk, I know that our publicity blurb talked a lot about creating the tools so that this will never happen again. And I really want to apologize for that. Because we are not any one of us individually going to create any tools that keep this from ever happening again. But together, I think we can move that needle and create a little more justice in the world. So thank you to Steve, to everybody else, and I want to turn it over to Lee to close us out. Kay, I'm sorry.
People confuse us all the time. We look alike. All right, and I'll close this out by saying thank you for being here. Thank you for being here online. I think everything that we're doing, even these little things, whether they be an act of protest, an act of resistance, push to try to change laws, providing space for people to interact and support each other, providing some kitchen space. All these things are acts of resistance, and I think they're all valuable. They may seem small, but together I think that's the way that we'll move the needle on this and change the narrative. The people who are coming from the southern border, they're not the problem. There's a problem, and they're not the problem. They're a wonderful resource, and we're grateful to have them in our community. All right.
There are copies of Steve's article on the
Yes, I already stole one. More copies, though, are over there of Steve's article. So please take one if you are interested in reading that. And then you can, once you're done with that, you can read these 8 books. All right. Once again, thank you. And yes, Dave?
There was just a question about the list of partners at the beginning. Will that be posted? And also,
yes.
Recording will also be made available to folks online.
Yes. this will be available and can be distributed. Yes. All right, this is just the beginning. It's a great beginning. It's just the beginning. Thank you. Thank you again to Steve.